Nothing in the SCP Foundation archive is more secretive than SCP-001. The files are buried beneath so many layers of security and encryption, you'd need to be an X-05 council member to gain access to them. And that's because whatever SCP-001 actually is, holds the secret to the SCP Foundation's creation. Because this issue is so controversial, SCP-001 is a designation given to over 30 different anomalies, each which hold a reasonable claim to being the reason the Foundation exists today. But one proposal among this list is more secretive than the rest. So secretive, in fact, that it was never even officially submitted into the filing system. It exists only as a story told directly by 051, one of the 13 members of the legendary 05 Council. What follows is an approximation of that story. This is Dr. Jack Bright's proposal, also known as The Factory. The Factory was a facility created by a wealthy industrialist named James Anderson in 1835. The building, which soon became known as the Anderson Factory, was a thing of industrial beauty for the time. A mile wide at its longest point, and 3 stories high, accommodating thousands of workers. Anderson himself resided in a special 7-story tower next to the building's gate, so he could oversee the factory's operations at all times. Anderson hoped for his new facility to dominate the American manufacturing industry, producing everything from weapons to food to toys to textiles. It would be the ultimate factory, where workers could live their entire lives on site. They would be born here, work here, live here, and eventually die here, like productive little drones inside an immense hive. The problem, if you couldn't already tell from the living conditions he enforced, was that James Anderson was a sociopathic monster, and he was believed to be a worshiper of Satan, along with several other pagan deities, and he turned the entire factory into a kind of demonic nightmare. Everything was arranged according to occult geometry, and the ground was covered in arcane symbols that could only be seen when blood was running across the ground. And given the horrific things that happened inside the factory, this was often the case. In his private journals, Anderson indicated that he thought of his workers as less than human, and many that died in the manufacturing process had their parts harvested for meat production to feed the others. But since Anderson was very good at keeping all this under wraps, new workers still flocked to his factory in droves. Factory workers were forced into 16-hour workdays by the facility's sadistic security force. They were packed into shared rooms like cattle to sleep in shifts, so that the factory never shut down and the work could always continue. Anyone too injured or weak to work was dragged off and murdered by security out of sight of the others. But the products were popular, and the factory didn't just endure, but thrived, all the way through the Civil War and beyond. However, one day a worker managed to escape that horrible place and finally began to tell her story to the outside world. These whispers made their way to President Grant in 1875, and he was outraged. He enlisted the help of an elite group of Union soldiers from the Civil War, a group that specialized in taking on and taking down the supernatural. And among this group were 13 exceptional people who'd one day go on to become the SCP Foundation's 05 Council, with a man who would later become known as 051 at the lead. The soldiers stormed the factory during the night and were met with a truly horrifying sight. Workers were diseased, starved, tortured, and neglected, living under conditions that would be considered too cruel even for livestock. The soldiers, enraged by what they saw, engaged with and slaughtered the security team. Little did they know, their greatest threats were yet to come. Whatever dark deals Anderson was making behind the scenes, they were paying off, because they allowed him to find another use for some of the workers who couldn't work. Through experiments that were half-twisted science and half-dark magic, he had turned his workers into horrific monsters, precursors to the kinds of anomalies the Foundation would battle in the decades that followed. They lost many good soldiers fighting the abominations in Anderson's factory, but when they finally reached him, they made him pay for his crimes against humanity. Anderson was given one of the most gruesome forms of execution possible. The soldiers hanged, drew, and quartered him before throwing away his dismembered remains. After Anderson's death, the soldiers spent a week trying to clean the place out. They freed any surviving prisoners and began cataloging the objects hidden within the factory. The entire place was still full of deadly traps and monsters, and they lost even more men during the cleanup effort. But in spite of all this, they managed to find something incredible. The factory was producing paranormal items of great power. They found toy weapons that were more powerful than real ones, skeletal horses that could run much faster than normal ones and would never tire, cloaks made of pure darkness that could transport the wearer into a realm of shadows. The soldiers found they were sitting on a gold mine of tools and weapons like no other, and suddenly, they felt a sense of great duty wash over them. They knew now that there were monsters out there, and only they had the knowledge and tools to fight them. They would utilize the factory that had brought humanity so much pain and turn it into a tool to defend the human race. The upper echelons of the soldiers formed what would be the original O5 Council and began building around the factory. Lower-ranking soldiers were designated as field operatives, and as time went on, they would expand their ranks further with men of science. The organization that would later become the mighty SCP Foundation had finally taken root. They would work outside the purview of the government, with President Grant being told that the factory had been destroyed. Instead, it had now become known as Site Alpha, the very first Foundation facility. They developed many of the organizational principles that would later define the Foundation as a whole, even down to developing a rudimentary D-class, known as the Disposables. The Proto-Foundation began gathering secrets, particularly secrets that the world's most powerful people didn't want coming to light. They managed to build an empire out of blackmail, forcing the rich and influential to bankroll their early endeavors into the supernatural. Things were going well, even better than they probably had hoped, until the year 1911, when things took a horrific turn. A new enemy to the Foundation had revealed themselves, a race of powerful entities that these early Foundation members took to calling the fairies, due to their nature as tricksters and their sensitivity to iron. But don't let the name fool you. These were some of the most devastating creatures the Foundation ever faced, as these fledgling soldiers were about to find out. They sent a team of their best men after the fairies, and the next time they saw these men, their severed heads were mounted on poles, attached to the beasts that the fairies ride. The creatures were ready to retaliate and led a brutal attack on Site Alpha. An attack so bad that it left O51 psychologically scarred to this day. By O51's own shameful admission, the fairies destroyed them in battle that day. Their superior strength, technology, supernatural powers, and numbers allowed them to rampage through Site Alpha and slaughter anyone in their path. They even killed 12 of the 13 O5 Council members, with O51 being the only survivor. He fled further into the factory, trying to escape the fairy hordes pursuing him. It seemed like there was no way to get out of this death trap, until he happened upon a golden door covered in strange symbols. He opened the door and found himself inside what appeared to be a different dimension, filled with a deep red light that pulsed like a giant heartbeat. In this strange place, he heard the voice of Anderson inside his mind, radiating out from his dismembered body parts that were floating in the ether. It seemed that the monster wasn't quite as dead as they'd first thought. Anderson told O51 that every time they used an object created in the factory, they were making the factory stronger. However, if the fairies took over the factory, they would destroy it and make the items useless. Anderson, on behalf of the factory, made them a deal. He would undo the deaths of the fallen Foundation members and give them the power to destroy the fairies, if O51 pledged their allegiance to the factory. Seeing no other choice, O51 took the deal. The slaughter at Site Alpha was undone, and O51 began a campaign of terror against the fairies as an act of revenge for what happened. They murdered every single fairy, entirely eliminating the species and wiping out all record of their existence. Even when the other members of the O5 Council tried to talk him out of it, O51 was insistent on leaving none alive. In the following century, the SCP Foundation flourished. It expanded itself worldwide, gaining vastly more personnel and modern technology to assist in its new mission of capturing anomalies rather than massacring them. The Foundation abandoned the factory, though, going back on his deal with Anderson. O51 personally had the place buried under rubble to ensure that it would never be discovered again. But what is buried is not always forgotten. To this day, a number of other anomalies have had connections to the factory, especially Dr. Wondertainment, a sinister toy company producing dangerous and anomalous playthings. The influence of the factory looms like a shadow over the Foundation's activities, and as always, every time one of its objects is used, it gets stronger. Will it remain buried under that rubble forever? Even 051 doesn't seem to think so. That factory is a place of pure dark energy, beyond human understanding. But one thing about it is easy to comprehend. It isn't happy that the Foundation and the O5 Council broke their deal with it, and perhaps someday soon, it'll come back and collect what it's owed.